Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Welcome to the ACLU of Pennsylvania's all membership webinar. My name is Claire Landau. I use she, her pronouns, and I am proudly serving as the acting executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania. It's hard to believe right now that it's been more than 2 months since Reggie Shuford, our departing executive director, transitioned to the North Carolina Justice Center. I have been honored to help guide us through this transition. And just because this is my first time in this space and introducing myself to many of you, I'll just start by taking that opportunity. I joined the organization in May of 2022 as deputy director, and prior to stepping into this role, my deputy director role is largely focused on the strategic plan and operations. And for a bit of background about myself, prior to coming to ACLU Pennsylvania, I spent 8 years working in organizational management as the chief of staff of Philadelphia's Board of Education, which was really working at the intersection of administration, public policy, and governance. And I'm just thrilled to be here with the ACLU of Pennsylvania. It's a dream for me. So where we are at this moment, I really feel fortunate to have taken on this task at this wonderful time in ACLU-PA history. As Reggie mentioned in his final blog, we are in strong standing after a very eventful year, defending our right to vote, fighting for reproductive rights and access to abortion, defending students' rights to learn, and urging legal reform in an effort to reduce mass incarceration, just to name a few of the major things we've been working on. As we prepare for 2024 and a new executive director, I'm focused on preparing for the year ahead, and we're just very excited to welcome a new ED soon to build upon these successes. So welcome to you. One of the things that's important to us here at ACLU-PA is increasing the diversity of our organization, every aspect of our organization, including membership. So that it reflects our large and diverse Pennsylvania. So with our member calls, there's often a broad range, and we've been excited to see a broad range of you joining today. Some of you have been with us for decades. Thank you. And some of you are new members. Welcome. We're delighted to have everyone here with us today. Before we get started, I also want to take a moment just to give a little bit of an overview of our organization for those of you joining for the first time. The American Civil Liberties Union is a national, nonpartisan organization founded over 100 years ago. Here in Pennsylvania, we are a staff of roughly 40, with offices in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Harrisburg. We have 35,000 members across the state, and nationwide, that number of members is approximately 1.7 million, which is wonderful. In Pennsylvania, our priority areas are decarceration, police reform, and voting rights. We try to spend 70 to 80% of our work geared towards these top priority issue areas. And then the rest of our time is designed for us to remain nimble and to be able to respond to the other emerging threats like reproductive rights and LGBTQ equality. All of our work incorporates ABIDE, which is authentic belonging, inclusion, diversity, and equity, and racial justice. And I am just incredibly proud to work alongside my brilliant colleagues who care deeply about protecting and advancing civil liberties for all Pennsylvanians. Today we're going to be talking about a topic at the intersection of every issue area that we work on, the Pennsylvania legislature. So before we get started, a few logistics. In a minute, I'm going to bring on our two guests, and we're going to spend about 40 minutes. They're going to spend about 40 minutes discussing life as the ACLU-PA lobbyist. And then I'll come back on at the end to have help with some Q&A. As an FYI, this webinar is being recorded, and we plan on posting it. So please share the information that you learned today and guide others in your communities towards this session. We will share it out once it's done. If you need closed captions, you can enable that feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen under live transcript. We will be utilizing the Q&A function during the call, so please use it. And then for folks who have dialed in, you can submit your questions by emailing donate, DONATE, at ACLU-PA.org. So with that, I want to welcome my colleagues, Andy Hoover, Director of Communications for ACLU-PA, and Liz Randol, the Legislative Director of ACLU-PA. Liz and Andy, so glad to have you here, and I hope you'll start by introducing yourselves. I'm going to go off camera, and I'll rejoin you for questions and answers later in the session.
Great. Thanks, Claire. Hey, Liz, and hey to all of our members out there listening and watching this afternoon. Really appreciate you tuning in and hearing what we had to say about the legislature, because trust me, there's plenty to say about the Pennsylvania General Assembly. But before we get too deep into it, Liz, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Liz Randol. I have been the legislative director here for 6 years. I think that's, just sort of leave it at that so we can get into the good stuff.
All right. Thanks, Liz. And I'm Andy Hoover. I'm the Director of Communications, pronouns he, him, his. I'm based in our Harrisburg office. Also spent just about 9 years, almost 9 years as legislative director before Liz. So for our members, you're getting 15 consecutive years of work as the lobbyist, the legislative director for the ACLU of Pennsylvania. And I really wanted to have this conversation with you, Liz, because I find that our private conversations are often entertaining, sometimes hilarious. You have to have a certain sense of humor to deal with the legislature. So with that in mind, let's jump right in. How would you describe a typical day for you as the ACLU-PA lobbyist, particularly a session day when they're working in Harrisburg?
So I'd say, a typical day, I'll rewind a little bit and say that probably the lead up to a session week is probably our most busy time. So Thursdays and Fridays, we tend to start getting notifications about committee meetings that are happening the following week. Fortunately, the House does give us, we are able to get a list of bills that are scheduled to run on the House floor the week before. The Senate is not quite so transparent with their operation. So sometimes we don't find out what's scheduled to run on the floor until Monday, until the morning of the first session day. And so I spend a lot of the time, we huddle with some of our other legislative team members, and sometimes comms, our communications team, and also some of our organizers and other people who might be doing some outreach. And so I spend a lot of time trying to figure out if there's bills that we are worried about, sending bills over to our legal team for their feedback and analysis about if we're need to kind of sharpen up what our position is, sending all that information over to members in enough time that they sort of know what our position is and what our concerns. Typically, it's usually around bills that we have concerns about. And so moving from that, trying to really get, and then activating our members. We have an advocate academy, and I'm sure we will at some point do include a link to that to join. But we have, it's sort of a smaller group of you all who may be interested in getting trained to be a constituent lobbyist, interested in getting more regular updates on bill movement. So we're not spamming everyone with our email actions. But if you're interested in that, we tend to send some of those notifications a little bit more frequently and earlier to some of our Advocate Academy members. And so when I get to when I get to Harrisburg, it's no 2 days are necessarily alike, but a lot of it is just spent. I actually, probably contrary to what most people might think, I don't really schedule a lot of one-on-one meetings on session days. I tend to leave my day open because the fluctuations throughout the day are so are pretty significant. And so I think one of the things that I like to focus on are the conversations that happen either in the hallways or in the cafeteria. It's amazing how much information you can glean from people when you're kind of not in a formal setting. I like to also chat up some of the reporters to find out what information they know or what their stories they're working on. And so that's sort of, running around from committee meetings, trying to track what's going on in both chambers. So it can be really hectic on session days, but a lot of structured, lobbyist work is done prior to the beginning of the session week.
Yeah, you can walk in there into the Capitol at 9 a.m. on a session day and not see sunlight until 4 in the afternoon, 5 in the afternoon. Right. Yeah. That's good. And I'm glad you mentioned the prep work too, Liz, because that is an important part of this. We track a lot of legislation and we prioritize certain things, whether it's in opposition to or in favor of. But that requires a lot of groundwork. I mean, sometimes there is often there is the rapid response that you described, like on Thursday and Friday when we get notification that there's legislation moving. But it also requires work even before that, knowing what's been introduced and what even has a chance to move and being prepared for that possibility.
Absolutely.
So one of our former colleagues tells a funny story about when she met you. She said, "I'll help you. I'll give you insight and help with the legal issues, but please keep me away from legislators." Your job really is unique among the staff positions here at ACLU-PA, and I'd say it takes a unique personality to do it. So what drives you? What keeps you doing this now 6 years in for ACLU-PA?
So I would say number one, caffeine is always a good driver all the time. So that's A. I think that particular comment was based on, there's a lot of things that are definitely unique about the working with the legislature. I'd say, it is an ecosystem kind of unto itself. It has its own its own structures, its own way of thinking about the world. And I think most people think of the legislators as just like politicians. And I have to say, in a lot of ways, they're just really regular, normal people. But there are a lot of quirky elements to it. And I think part of what I enjoy about it, what makes me sort of get up in the morning and want to do this job, are a couple of things. I think first, I have always been a huge fan of the ACLU. I find it a huge honor and just a real dream, really, to represent this organization with 100+ years of weight and heft behind it. I think really smart positions. I tend to personally agree. I don't think there's anything that the ACLU has taken a position on with which I personally disagree or have misgivings. So that's a huge benefit. I would say, and really loving our mission. I also love, selfishly a little bit. I would say, I like how unpredictable it is. I do love the kind of, the turmoil and kind of craziness that goes along with trying to deal with a lot of the ups and downs and unexpected things that pop up in the middle of any particular day. I love, there's nothing better for me than I feel like I've been in school for forever at the ACLU. I get to learn so many things, work on so many different issues, get the benefit of the insight and input. I check in with Andy regularly on things. A lot of times some of the issues that the legislature deals with or brings up are cyclical. So we've often worked on some of the issues before. So there's long histories behind some of those. Our legal team is incredibly smart and talented. So I get the benefit of all of the smart people giving me their insight and intel in order to put together some of our memos. And I do love working with our members and people that are engaged. I love helping people sort of navigate, and our allies in particular too. I love navigating helping people figure out how to navigate the legislature. I like doing some of our lobbyist trainings, trying to give people better insight. I think people feel really nervous and unsure and somehow not skilled enough to engage with their legislators. And it's really quite easy. Legislators are pretty open and receptive and solicitous even of, hearing from their constituents. And so trying to demystify that process a little bit. And then I'll just sort of say finally that, given how difficult our recent political landscape has been, there's nothing more satisfying than knowing that I get to have a job that allows me to feel like I am doing something. There's nothing more, I think, sort of soul crushing sometimes than to feel like the whole world is changing. There's all these terrible things happening and there's not a lot we can do about it. But I feel like my job is a gift that I get to just feel like every day I get to feel like I am doing something that makes a difference. So I love this. It's not hard to be driven by, in this work.
And it is interesting when that last comment, I appreciated all your comments, but I wanted to say something about that last comment, which is that, change sometimes, I remember someone saying to me that change in the legislature is glacial.
Yes.
But then sometimes it can happen in a snap. Like you don't even realize it. I was just having a conversation, which I'm going to give shout out to our podcast, which I host. So I was just having a conversation with our colleague, Marion, and our ally, Khalif from Common Cause this morning for a future podcast episode. And we were talking about how we're going to talk about some accomplishments here, and you're going to talk a little bit about some voting reform. But we were talking in that conversation about how advocates set the groundwork, and there you go through moments and long periods of time where it looks like, wow, nothing is happening. This is stagnant. We're just sitting here in inertia. And then suddenly, bam, something happens at the legislature or between the governor and the legislature. And this thing that you've spent maybe years setting up suddenly is coming through.
Yeah, that tipping point is always, it's a little jarring, but it's also exhilarating. Yes, it can be, like you said, it's both glacial and sort of frenetic.
So with that in mind, before we talk about what's happening and what's ahead, let's look back. We just went through 8 years with a Democratic governor and Tom Wolf and a Republican-controlled legislature. What do you consider some of ACLU-PA's achievements in recent years?
So I might lean on you, Andy, too, to fill in for some of this, because I feel like I think there's different ways of defining what it means to have an accomplishment. I mean, a lot of our work often is defensive, which I like to think of as a very active way of preventing bad things from happening. So I don't look at it as passive by any stretch of the imagination. Often we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to beat back bad things. So I'd say, I maybe put our accomplishments in 3 or 4 buckets. One would be kind of a defensive win, so to speak, which was over the course of the last couple of sessions, we had a probation reform bill that we had championed. The bill was not only gutted, but sort of amended to almost make certain elements of probation worse than it currently is. And so we had to sort of shift gears, which is always really just devastating when you have to start advocating against a bill that you had originally been trying to advance. And so sometimes that's happened in the past where we've had to move our position to neutral. But I think, this one it took a all out, all hands on deck. And this was largely in collaboration with the huge coalition of our grassroots directly impacted organizations who are trying to push back on that bill. So we successfully defeated it from the bad version of it from passing. I would say one example of something that's kind of been the glacial sort of change, but I think is really important, is kind of tracking the longevity of changes throughout sort of on one issue over numerous sessions. And I would highlight there kind of the decreasing or I would say maybe increasing reluctance to vote for any mandatory minimum bills. And so we've seen that both in the committee votes and on the floor. And then following from that, both Governor Wolf and Governor Shapiro sort of making pledges to not enact any legislation that would have reinstated any mandatory minimums in our criminal justice, in our criminal code. And so that's been great. I would say a good example of some of our integrated advocacy was this sort of 1-2 punch that we had with Marcy's Law. If some of you recall that amendment, it was a crime victims' rights bill that was, we thought, created a lot of incredibly huge dangers for defendants, but it was a constitutional amendment, and so we lobbied really hard in the legislature against it, trying to get votes against it. We knew it was probably a losing cause in terms of the votes. It's hard to get a legislator to vote against something that's entitled, rights of crime victims. And but when we did the handoff after that, it moved over to our legal team who successfully defeated it in the courts. And then finally, I think the biggest one that many people might be most aware of was Act 77, which was the election reform bill that most importantly gave us vote by mail, which fortunately I cannot imagine what would have happened during the elections. That was passed, what was it, Andy, 2019, I think that was passed, Act 77. So, before the pandemic, we sort of had vote by mail in place, and it was a huge lift for the counties. And so always make sure you thank a poll worker and like all your county election people, because a lot of the work they do is thankless and difficult, and in particular, trying to pull off an election with vote by mail, a new vote by mail system, and a pandemic happening sort of concurrently was unexpected, but really, I can't even imagine how awful it would have been had we not had vote by mail in place. And so I'd focus maybe on those as highlights. What about you, Andy? Is there anything that you can think of?
Yeah. So an example of how the work kind of you connect dots to me is how the moratorium on executions has happened. And I did see there was a question in the chat about the death penalty. Going way back. So for our members who've been around for a while, if we have any board members who knew him personally, my predecessor as legislative director was Larry Frankel, who did this for 16 years for us before moving on to our national office. And we sadly passed away about a year or two later. But I remember Larry saying, we were talking about the idea of a legislatively approved study on the death penalty. And people have been around for a while, get a little jaded and cynical about these studies because it sounds like a way to kick the can down the road or avoid dealing with an issue. But I do remember Larry saying this keeps the conversation going. And that we actually got a resolution through the Senate, I don't know, 2011, maybe 2012, somewhere around there, 2010. I don't remember the exact year, but we got a resolution through the Senate thanks to the late Senator Stuart Greenleaf, who was a Republican from Montgomery County, to do that study. And in fact, our then executive director, Reggie Shuford, ended up serving on that commission. And Governor Wolf comes into office. So the study is finished. It finds all the problems we've always said exist with the death penalty. Governor Wolf comes in, and I think it was the first month that he was in office. It may have been like the first 2 weeks. He implements a moratorium on executions, and he specifically cites that legislative study for the moratorium. And now, about a month ago, Governor Shapiro announces he's continuing the moratorium, and he went a step further than Governor Wolf, and he said, we just need to get rid of the death penalty. We haven't had an execution in 30 years. We'd still have a little over about 120, 125 people who have a sentence of death in PA. And which Governor Shapiro, again, like I said, went further than Governor Wolf did in that announcement. They both said they will not they will not sign death warrants, or if they sign them, they'll rescind them. So that's an example of how, like, over years of work and doing the little pieces that seem like not much in the moment can lead to bigger things. So I want to ask, speaking of Governor Shapiro, I want to talk a little bit about the current political dynamics in Harrisburg. We have a new governor, Josh Shapiro, former attorney general, former commissioner in Montgomery County, and also a former state house member. He's a Democrat like his predecessor, Tom Wolf, but he's a different person, obviously. So the Republicans have also lost their lock on the legislature. The Democrats hold a one-seat majority in the state house. And I always tell people that we are nonpartisan. And frankly, you and I can tell some war stories about Democrats not being particularly helpful on civil liberties. It doesn't mean being nonpartisan doesn't mean being oblivious to facts or context, though. A change in the majority in the House changes the dynamics of what we can expect to see in this 2-year session, which runs until November of 2024. So, Liz, with the new governor and a new majority in the House, how do you expect things to be different over the next 2 years compared to how things have functioned in recent years?
So I mean, look, I think having a one vote majority is really razor thin. That assumes that all of the entire membership of the Democratic caucus will always vote in lockstep. And, so I'll be the Debbie Downer first here, just in terms of managing expectations, which is, I think being very clear-eyed about that razor thin majority and the fact that the Democratic caucus is still very diverse. And by diverse, I mean both in terms of demographically diverse, but also diverse in terms of their political leanings. And so they're much more diverse in terms of where they land on a spectrum. And I think even perhaps more so than we have even in the Republican caucus. And so in order for good things to pass, it's going to be touch and go even on the House side. That does not necessarily, whatever might, even if the best things in the world might pass in the House, they still have to get through the Senate. Which is still Republican controlled and still has a very, a fairly comfortable majority for the Republicans. So I'll say, just being a little bit realistic about what the chances are there. But I do think that there's a huge opportunity for, in two ways. I mean, I think that the dynamics in the General Assembly will change because there will at least be more, there will be different priorities, different dynamics between the two chambers. I think there's going to be an opportunity also for us as advocates. I mean, I have not been in this position since when there's been a split legislature. And so I think it means that we also have to kind of think about our role as lobbyists and as an organization as a very, as a strong, sort of powerful voice that is not just that we have to elbow our way in. But I will say that even since it's flipped, I mean, the number of requests that we've received on a whole host of things, feedback on potential legislation, reviewing bill language, soliciting our, participation in different events is a really good sign because I feel like some of our, what we advocate on and the positions that we hold are kind of are being highlighted a little bit more and being a bit more solicited from some of the legislature. But I do, I think it will be, and I will also say this, I think I have very competing and sort of regularly fluctuating feelings sometimes about being frustrated with, say, any new leadership, whether it's Democrat or Republican, tends to need a little bit of time to figure stuff out. Most of the people that are in the legislature have not been were not elected when there was a majority. And so there were some growing pains on the Republican side. I feel like that, they couldn't believe that they had lost the majority. And so we're still trying to act as if they had the majority. And I feel like it's one thing to be in a position of trying to punch holes in what a majority is saying. And then it's another thing to be responsible for laying out a plan of action, particularly when you're dealing with a lot of members with very different positions, some in very blue safe districts, some in very purple districts, trying to talk with increasingly red districts. So I feel like there's a little, there's some growing pains there. So I try to be patient, even though I get frustrated sometimes in terms of where I see some of the action happening and being sort of making some bold statements and setting out a bold agenda. I think it sounds great, but it also, to me, I'm much more of a political realist sometimes and would like to see, I'm fine with, I would prefer to see small, this is not going to be the fun, sexy conversation, but I mean, I would honestly prefer to see small, like good incremental changes and reforms that can be accomplished and implemented very easily, or at least in a clean way. So it's not sort of loaded up with random provisions and if then clauses or what have you, rather than trying to swing too much and not, you can stake your ground, but I think also trying to be realistic about how something actually moves through the legislature, which includes, is going to have to include the Senate and being able to get all of your own members on board. What would you say, Andy? I'm just curious I don't want to go too much over time here, but
that's okay. I was going to, and we're getting some great questions in the Q&A. I can't wait to get to the Q&A part, some of which are actually getting to some of the things we're talking about. On that issue of partisanship and our priorities, I'm going to ask you about our priorities, but I think it's noteworthy that in our strategic framework, our 3 priority issues where we spend majority of our time, but not all of our time, are voting rights, decarceration, and policing. And on this issue of nonpartisanship and bipartisanship, the criminal justice issues really can swing in different directions. It's some of the issues we work on, let's just face it, have hardened along party lines. But criminal justice, the criminal legal system, is one that really hasn't. And in fact, I would say Democrats, much to our chagrin, are still susceptible to demonization on criminal justice. And sometimes there are Republicans who get on board with a variety of criminal legal reforms. And if you get right folks in the right places, you never know what can happen. I mentioned Senator Greenleaf. He was someone who was a former prosecutor and ultimately became a reformer. So you just never know who is going to be the next person to see the light and understand our issues.
I'll just piggyback on that for a second. I think this answers, or this could have been a response to a lot of the questions you've already asked. But I think one of the, what I love about the job, but also where I think we can be the most successful, is in some of our work where we have alliances with, say, more conservative organizations like Americans for Prosperity. We have a lot of overlap in terms of what some of our priority areas are. There's it's dwindling a bit, but there are, libertarian leaning Republicans that remain in the House and are typically open to a lot of things in terms of, everything from, civil asset forfeiture to privacy issues. Some of them in terms of policing. So some of the sort of natural inclination for libertarians to be suspicious of state government power tend to align with where we are, our positions on certain things. And so, I feel like there's, I do worry a bit that the idea that something is bipartisan no longer doesn't have the same attractive quality that it did before. I feel like, our politics has become so combative recently that a lot of it is about just getting into these skirmishes and dust ups and battles, but, that are very sort of culture war battles. And so trying to say that something is, that something is, is bipartisan doesn't really excite people. They're like, well, I don't want to get along with them. I don't want to do anything that's going to help them out. But I do think that there's still there is a lane to do that. And I do love trying to, roam around in that space a bit, trying to find some of those those surprising and if not, unusual kinds of alliances that we might have with some of the strange bedfellows that politics very naturally creates and, necessitates often.
I'm glad you're still optimistic about libertarian Republicans. I'm a bit cynical about them.
I try, Andy. I know. Come on.
But I'm also, in the interest of being nonpartisan, let me be clear that I'm also pretty cynical about Democrats ducking on criminal legal reform. And frankly, I think the politics overall are on our side. Voters have rejected a lot of the fear. Look at some of the recent elections, whether it's Larry Krasner or John Fetterman. You see voters not being persuaded by be afraid, be very afraid type of messages.
That's right. Absolutely.
What are ACLU-PA? So the session is a 2-year session. It just started in January and it goes till November of 2024. What are our legislative priorities for this session?
So that's always sort of a tough question because I feel like anytime, even with some of I feel like our strategic plan is held up incredibly well, to be honest. But, trying to set a priority sounds great. And then as soon as session starts, everything, just changes because that's how it goes. So, I say this a little bit in jest, but not really. I think one of the first priorities is to just do less harm. Is a huge, and I think that's really, I would say probably 80 some odd %, just roughly speaking, of the the lobbying that I do is on criminal legal reform bills. And typically up till now, it's been trying to beat back just really outrageous, awful, terrible bills. And so I'm looking forward to a session where we just don't have some of at least one chamber like churning those bills out at the kind of breakneck pace that we've seen over the past umpteen sessions. And so I think, priority one is to just, put down your pens. We say this in our More Law, Less Justice report. Number one recommendation to legislators when it comes to reforming or changing the criminal legal code is just like, in some ways, just stop. So, we have enough offenses. We have a lot of those things were already covered a million times over. So do less harm. I would say some of the things that have been that were priorities that are kind of shaping up in different ways. One, which was really encouraging with the governor's budget address, was his emphasis on providing additional funding for indigent defense. I think Pennsylvania is the only, or maybe there's a second state now, but we're either the only or one of two states that provides no state level funding for people to get legal counsel if they can't afford to pay for counsel on their own. And so the governor sort of had announced a $10 million recurring sort of line item in his budget for counties to send to counties to help fund indigent defense. It's been, like I said, sort of a pipe dream of the ACLU and something that we knew would take a very long time. I think it still will take a long time for those for county public defender offices to be resourced the way that they should be and funded fully the way that they need to be in order to make our system work properly. But it is a start, and it's probably, to be honest, is more than what I was expecting in terms of that kind of full-throated support and literally putting his money where his mouth is. So I would say, working on indigent defense, we would love to see the good probation bill pass. I think there's some good. There was openness even in the Senate for probation reform. So trying to kind of take the reins back and be proactive about trying to re-up some of those good things with the hopes that it doesn't get amended into oblivion again. I mean, it's maybe I'm being naive, but I would like to think that we might be able to get something good out of that. There are some conversations around passing the Fairness Act, or the non-discrimination bill that would allow, that would at least protect people from discrimination in Pennsylvania. Most people, I think that we have a law that does that. We do not. But I should say we have ways people are protected. It's just not in the kind of clear way that a statute would provide for. So non-discrimination. And then I think certainly with any of our election related reforms, ensuring that there's no, we would certainly want to ensure that there's no resurfacing, as we talked about cyclically, voter ID being something that tends to be the bad penny that resurfaces from time to time, and just making sure that penny stays buried, but also looking at trying to encourage the legislature to consider enacting early voting and same day registration, in addition to some other additional reforms that might help counties, like pre-canvassing and providing notice to people who have not filled out their ballot correctly when it's mailed back in prior to them actually opening the ballot. So there are a few in there. Did I leave anything out there, Andy? Can you think of anything else where?
That's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah.
that'll keep you busy for the next 20 months.
Absolutely.
You and our team. So we have a number of really interesting questions in the chat from some familiar names. Great to see some folks we know that have joined us today. So I just want to ask you one more question, and then we can get to the Q&A. And that Great. Question is, just for a little fun. So we like to give on these webinars. One of the things we like to do is that we want to have conversations with our members and for our members where they get information that might not be otherwise heard publicly. It's beyond the talking points. That's kind of, I guess, the point of these webinars and these conversations. So with that in mind, tell us something or several things that might surprise people about the legislature or life at the Capitol.
All right. So a couple of things, and maybe some of you all that have been on our trainings, I will say this when I cover, when I talk about what it's like to engage with legislators. First, is that they're actually really nice, regular, open people, and that the relationships inside the building, like I said before, I mean, it is its own ecosystem. And Andy, we were talking earlier, and you had mentioned this, that there's people are really nice. They get along. Like there's interesting, odd sort of like friendships that people have with legislators that you would never necessarily suspect. So I think that some of what you might see on the floor or on social media is sometimes not how, they sort of live in this like weird, I don't mean bubble in terms of being insulated, although there is a little bit of that, of course, but it's also a very intense sort of pressure cooker. And I think that with any kind of, there is bonding that happens between and among legislators and staff that happens. I would say also, the value of really sometimes prioritizing staff over legislators. The staff are really the real engines that make a lot of this stuff happen, that are the ones responsible for needling legislators on different things. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't meet with your representative or senator, but I would say that there's definitely, I think, never underestimate the value and role of staffers. Probably a bummer thing to realize is just how infrequently sometimes legislators read bills. They are not terribly good at just reading the fine print, which is just terrifying sometimes. And so a lot of the time that I spend is really Andy and I were joking a while back about this is when I was in some tailspin because I was so frustrated about just the basic lack of knowledge. I think it was about the body cams bill, Andy, and the police body cams bill. And that really did some bad things. I mean, we were fine with body cams, but this particular piece of legislation just did some really ruinous, introduced some really bad, took it out of the realm of right to know disclosure. And so, the more I was talking with, and this was with Democrats who were like, no, we need body cams. I'm like, did you read the bill? And so I was like, Andy, can we just do a podcast called, Did You Read This Bill? Because sometimes they didn't read it, and they'll work from talking points or what a colleague has said.
And just to be clear, that would not be one episode. That could be a series that would be a podcast series called Have You Read This Bill?
That's right. I mean, and so it just, and sometimes it's different intonation. So it would be like, did you read this bill? Or did you read this bill? So depending on what the emphasis is, sometimes some of them are really out there, some of the bills. But I think I'm trying to underscore that it is not infrequent that someone who just has read the bill knows more than the legislator. So this even goes back to my point that these are not impenetrably sort of, I'm not denigrating them, but it's not like they're so, they're just regular people. And so if you read a bill, your chances are pretty good that you might have a little more knowledge about a particular piece of legislation than even a legislator that you've scheduled a meeting with.
And even when you read the bill, unless you are trained or have experience in that particular area of law, even reading it might not fully give you a grasp of what the thing does.
Well, and that's really where I feel like, particularly with our criminal legal bills, we actually have a session that we do for legislators and staffers, literally called How to Read a Criminal Offense Bill. And so it's a way, because if you don't know much, I'm not an attorney. I've never practiced criminal law. I now feel like, I have a little bit of public defender envy. So I really love learning about all of that. But and so I feel like I can navigate, or I know what we're looking for. But a lot of legislators who don't have that background, this is why there are committees in both chambers, that they are supposed to be populated with people that have some, or at least are, charged with having a bit more knowledge about a particular type of issue, and can then sort of signal to the rest of the membership whether they like it, they would want to support it or not. Because legislators have to deal with so many different, there's no possible way one human can know that much about all of these different issues at that level. And so a lot of what we do with our lobbying is trying to be the voice in combination with a lot of our allies, including a lot of public defenders, is trying to break the habit of the legislature of deferring to or just calling up their DA or listening to the District Attorneys Association for feedback about like really what the bill does, which is, we will give one version of it and they'll give another. And so they need to have more of that kind of 360 perspective. But yeah.
All right, so we're going to bring Claire back. We have a number of questions in the Q&A section. If folks have questions, we'll try to answer them between now and 1:30. But Claire, why don't you tee us up here?
Thank you, Liz and Andy. Thank you for this conversation. We are going to move to some Q&A. Thank you to everyone who is sharing all of these great questions in the chat. And I hope if you have some questions that you have not put in the chat yet, please put them there. I don't think we're going to be able to get to everything, but and a few of these it looks like have been covered through some of your conversation. But let's try and get to some. I think one important one just right away is there a place that everyone can find some Know Your Rights guides and resources about what we're currently doing in the legislature? Where can folks go?
So we do have our Know Your Rights. We have a page on our website that includes all of our Know Your Rights information. And we do have our legislative page that has like the positions on all of the different bills that we've taken positions on, including also any testimony that we've offered. We are actually, our next meeting with our comms team is to look at how to be able to sort of share on our website a bit more of the information, whether it's our lobbyist trainings, our lobbying toolkit. We do have a lot of our sort of nitty gritty stuff is we do through our Advocate Academy. And so I would certainly encourage members, even if you just want to be on the list, to kind of check out our the different alerts that we send, but also that's where we notify a lot of people about our upcoming like lobbying trainings and issue explainers. So I would encourage people to sign up and register to become an Advocate Academy member. We also have, and I think on the top of our legislative page, a link to our scorecard. It's pretty sparse right now since the legislature has not been taking very many votes, but we have that scorecard is updated in real time over the course of the session. It also includes previous scores in prior sessions. And so that's a good way to kind of check in on your specific representative and or senator to see how they voted on any of the particular issues that we might have that we've taken positions on, because we score a lot. I mean, I think, and last session was just bruising. I mean, we almost doubled the number of bills that we took positions on. So I think we had like approximating 100 memos. I mean, it was just like sort of gobsmacking, but so we score a lot of different things to kind of give people a flavor on all of our different issue areas. So I would say those are probably the resources to check out.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, Sarah, who I see is putting in the chat links to some of these resources. And we did have Liz mentioned our Advocate Academy. So we've shared information about that in the chat as well, which might be a great resource for those of you who are interested in this area. We had a question. You mentioned the death penalty and the moratorium on the death penalty that Governor Shapiro put in place, but we had a question about whether there was any chance that PA could now join the majority of states that have actually abolished the death penalty.
Well, I don't think I think the number of states that have been abolishing the death penalty has been increasing. I don't think we're at a majority yet, but I unfortunately don't think it is. The politics are ripe yet in the legislature. I will say that, and by the way, this is the issue. This issue was like my gateway into the ACLU. I started doing this work. I did anti-death penalty work 23 years ago, and that's how I ended up at the ACLU. I think the public honestly couldn't care less. In 2014, Governor Wolf filled out a candidate questionnaire where he said he supported a moratorium on executions, and Tom Corbett never said a word about it. You all went through the 2022 elections and heard some of the talk. We talked earlier about the tough on crime messaging, and that just didn't resonate. I feel like there was at least an ad or two that talked about the death penalty in one of those races. And I think the public has moved on. I mean, sure, if you ask the question, do you or do you not support the death penalty, you might get a majority, maybe a slim majority, 55, 60%. But the legislators, I joke sometimes that politicians are often the last to know things. When the rest of the public has gotten to a place, the politicians are the last to know. And I feel like that's how it is with the death penalty. Unfortunately, I just don't know if the votes are there right now.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. And I will say this, and this sort of goes back to my early days. I was a philosophy professor at a university. And so I do like to look at the sort of theory of the case, I guess, sometimes. But, the legislators being the last to know, I mean, it's kind of the way democracies are supposed to function, which is kind of slow and snail paced. I mean, governments and democracies in general were intended to replace coups. I mean, well, until recently, I suppose, but were intended to be something that was intentionally made to work at a very slow pace. And so sometimes the level, we may not be so excited about a legislature that's extra responsive to wherever the winds are. And so I think sometimes it's that slow building of consensus or not caring or it just not being that big of a deal that then we get, whether it's something like no mandatory minimums getting reenacted or the death penalty moratorium just existing sort of on and on. So I think, it will hopefully, but the death penalty is such a different creature. And it is, I share the our members' concern about, it would be really nice if we just got rid of it, but rather just at least no deaths happening, no execution. So.
We have a question in the chat that just came in about rules and whether there are any new rules in this session that we should be aware that we, the folks on this call, should be aware of in advocating on issues of importance. Anything that folks should be aware of. And
this is Professor Lou Rowley, who's been one of our great allies on civil asset forfeiture, asked this question. And I love this question because it's so Liz, this is legislative nerd alert type question. I love it. So and there's been some really important changes there. So I definitely would be interested in hearing your take on that.
No, I got shout out to anyone who pays attention to rules because they are really, it's always the person who knows the rules that really has the most power in any sort of setting. So the person, I've always sort of also had some envy of parliamentarians because it's really, you can do good and bad things, depending on how well you know the rules. So I appreciate that question. I think, for the most part, a lot of the rules are the same. Some of the things that did change were the overall. I don't know that this is has a huge consequence, but the number of people that sit on each committee has been reduced, and so I feel like there's, it's not quite, I feel like they, with fewer people on standing committees, so that would be say the health committee or judiciary committee or education, labor, people are held a bit more accountable, I feel like. But most importantly, there were three major changes that were largely the result of a lot of work that we had done around some of the threats around constitutional amendments, where the past couple of sessions, the previous majority had really tried to use constitutional amendments as an end run around the governor's power, because any amendments do not go to the governor for a veto or enactment. So they just pass. Constitutional amendments have to pass with identical language in 2 consecutive legislative sessions, and then it just goes on the ballot. And so there is no executive branch engagement there. And so they changed a couple of things. One is that you can no longer put multiple amendments into one bill. So each amendment will have its own piece of like legislation that moves through. Any amendment, at least for the House, will require a public hearing. So that might include if the Senate has done a public hearing, that could suffice, but the House could also do it. But at least it has to have one public hearing prior to passage, and that it changed the timing for when the House at least would pass a proposed amendment on second passage. This is definitely getting in the weeds, but to prevent amendments from being on a primary election ballot. And so trying to move the timing so that the next available election that a amendment could appear on a ballot would have to be in a general election that would ensure that the most number of Pennsylvanians could weigh in on a particular constitutional question. So I think I would highlight those 3 just because, we don't really lobby on those. We don't do a lot of lobbying on rules. It's a very internal thing. We're very aware of them. But the business with the constitutional amendments was something that we really kind of leaned on them about that. So.
Well, there are so many great questions pouring into the chat, and we're just at time. So let me just do a quick lightning round on 2 of them. Efforts to ban books. Are we watching for efforts to ban books right now?
Yes, but that's really happening at the school district level. So that's not a legislative question. But yes, we are definitely paying attention to county level.
And I think in a similar one, voting rights and efforts to change the way that different counties are providing access to the vote. Are we doing anything at the legislative level, or is that county level? How are we working on that?
So if I understand the question, I think I think we're doing a lot of that at the county. Go ahead.
So we are. This is actually, I mentioned an upcoming podcast episode we're doing with Common Cause and our colleague Marion. We were actually talking about this earlier, which you all get to hear in a few weeks. So there are issues that at the county level that could be resolved if the legislature resolved them. So, for example, whether or not counties can alert mail and absentee voters that there is an error with their ballot or the envelope that their ballot was in. The legislature could pass rules to address that. Unfortunately, they have not. So I guess the answer to the question, Liz, would be we will look for opportunities if there are ways to help voters to create uniform rules on voting. Absent that, we are either going to have to advocate county by county or litigate some of these issues.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Liz. We are at time, and I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been here with us and put all these amazing questions in the chat. We're going to follow up. So if there was a question that wasn't answered, we will try to follow up on that. And again, just want to say thank you to you, Andy and Liz, for sharing some of your expertise and wisdom from all of your experience in Harrisburg with us. And then I want to give an extra thank you right now to Jackie Rosen, who is behind the scenes for us right now, keeping us organized, running the tech. Thank you, Jackie. If you are on the call and you enjoyed today's discussion and you're able to consider a gift today, please visit aclupa.org/donate to make a donation. And I also hope you'll check out the various ways to get involved. We talked about some of them today, but there are many more, and we would love to have your involvement. So with that, we'll end the call for today. Thank you, everyone. We hope you are well, and that we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.